Um, Lovely to see everybody here. And this is, I think, the fifth session of the Edurio Book Club. And I couldn't be more excited to be speaking to Leora Cruddas today about her new book, The New Domains of Educational Leadership. Uh, Leora, I don't think we need to have an introduction for you. Everybody knows you as the CEO of the Confederation of School Trusts, but we'll be talking about your literary endeavors today. So welcome, Leora, to the session today.
Thank you, Ernest. It's a delight to be here with you.
Thank you. All right. Well, I've got a ton of questions. As I mentioned, if anyone wants to follow up on a theme that we're covering today, please contribute via the chat, or feel free to raise your hand, and we can bring you into the conversation. We won't be trying to give a mini presentation of the book, so this will be a discussion around some of the topics and the themes raised by Leora. Um, and this will aim to complement the understanding of the book, whether you've read it already or not. So we'll be trying to cover the main concepts. So, Leora, the new domains of educational leadership, can you talk through the idea of the book, how long you've been working on it, and why now, and what's your overall ambition with publishing this piece?
Sure. Thanks, Ernest. So, why now? Two reasons. Since our inception 7 years ago, we've been developing the narratives and policy that support the trust sector to develop. And these have been published in lots of different places. So, through our think pieces, through our discussion papers, through speeches that I've given. And I suppose I wanted to narrate a coherent story through all of this, through this thought leadership, in order to build a narrative for leaders. So that's the first reason. The second reason is I wanted to respond to the leadership challenges that face us now. So it seems to me that the pressure on our children and communities, the pressures are so profound that the solutions are beyond the reach of individuals or indeed organizations to respond, individual organizations to respond. So if our children are to flourish, then I think we need to develop a new mental model of leadership. And I guess that's what the book tries to do.
Thank you. And in many ways, it is a collation of a lot of the work that you and other colleagues at the CST and beyond have been doing. I guess I'm wondering where the frameworks that are represented in the book, were they the beginning and you've tried to summarize those, or were you always looking to fill concrete gaps within this framework that you've been working to? So what came first, the overall layout, or the individual work happening underneath that?
The overall, the overall framework, the three nested leadership narratives. So, only just a bit of a story there. I, as some colleagues on the webinar today will have heard me tell the story. I first started thinking that the challenges that face us were so complex that we might need to rethink our mental model of leadership over the Christmas period of 2019. And I wrote the first paper, which we called Systems of Meaning back then, which began to set out these three nested leadership narratives. So leadership of your organization, or trust leadership, civic leadership, and system leadership. I wrote that first paper in December 2019. We published it in the January. 8 weeks later, a global pandemic. And I did think, oh, probably not the best time to start thinking about new domains of educational leadership. And then through the pandemic, in particular, this notion of civic leadership really caught on, because that's what we were doing. The global pandemic was such a challenge. I mean, it was a novel context. None of us had ever led through that before, and it tested our leadership completely. We were being asked to do things that were outside of any of our experience, and in some ways, it was terrifying, wasn't it, to be responsible for the welfare, the education, the safety of our children in that period was a bit terrifying. And the only way that we could respond to this challenge was by working with others. So we saw civic leadership emerge as a thing in the global pandemic. So I suppose that concept of civic leadership started to be tested in the real world environment of a novel global pandemic, such that when the global pandemic, well, I say ended, I'm not sure it ended, but when we opened our schools for all of our children to return to our schools, it seemed to me I needed to revisit that paper and to make it relevant in a kind of post-pandemic context. So I rewrote that as the New Domains of Educational Leadership, which again was a short think piece. And then while I was doing that, I realized there was probably a book. So I started work on the book, or thinking about the book, just after we published the second in the think pieces, which was called New Domains of Educational Leadership, the same as the book is called.
Fantastic. And yeah, I remember many conversations with trust leaders through that time. And I remember one head of people saying how during this period, this was the first time the trust realized that you can't just wait for the government to tell you what to do. You need to actually work on the thing for the children, regardless of what the government's doing, because they will, everything's changing every week. And I think that echoes a lot of what you talk about in the trust of guiding the system, designing your own system. Now, talking about those three domains, the trust leadership, civic leadership, and system leadership, the trust leadership is the most understandable for, that's the most closely to what we'd expect in a book about leading a trust. Can you briefly introduce those three tiers and what the distinct differences are between those?
Sure. So the first narrative, as I said, is about leadership of the organization. And I should say, Ernest, and again, colleagues who know me on this call know I believe this. I don't use the word MAT, the acronym for Multi-Academy Trust, in the book, or indeed in anything that CST writes, because I think it's an ugly term. And I think parents don't understand what it means. And I think particularly as we approach a white paper, I'm not sure we can use that term as the basis for the future education system that we are building. So I believe firmly parents send their children to a school. So as CST, we use the term school trust. And it's really important to say as well, I suppose the corollary of that belief is, school trusts, they're not the marketization, the corporatization of education. So the majority of school trusts are groups of schools working in deep and purposeful collaboration in a single legal entity under strong strategic governance. These are collaborative structures. And I think the primary leadership task is about creating high quality education through developing expertise and curriculum and teaching across the whole group in a financially sustainable way. But I think there is a wider consideration beyond the knowledge and competence of trust leaders to lead their organization. And I think we must put this at the heart of our reform journey. So this simple and powerful purpose that education is a public good. And if that's true, we need to work within our local systems and create wider public good. So the second domain is civic leadership, plays right into that notion of education as a public good. And it was in talking to the Civic University Commission, so I was very pleased to be able to invite to give evidence to the Civic University Commission. And I was asked to think hard about the civic role of universities. I realized that school trusts are civic organizations too, just like universities, just like NHS trusts. So I started to talk about civic trusts and about trust leaders as civic leaders who create the conditions for collective impact by addressing the complex issues that affect children and young people that require civic actors to work together. So as well as leading a group of schools, trust leaders must look out beyond their organizations and work with other civic leaders. But even this, although entirely necessary, I still thought was not sufficient. So this brought me to the third of the nested leadership narratives, which is system leadership. And as you know, Ernest, I defined system leadership actually back then in 2019 as acting on and not just acting in the system. And I still think this is the right definition of system leadership. And as you said a moment ago, I worried back then, and I think I still worry, that sometimes in education we are beset by a compliance mindset. So we wait for governments to determine the policy context. We wait for governments to tell us what to do. Usually then we rail against it, and then mostly we comply with it. So this is what I would call acting in the system. I believe acting on the system gives us an opportunity to think differently. So we should think of leadership as the ability to shape the system. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been working in the sector for a decade now with Edurio, and the trust sector has gone through many steps of maturity, and I think there's still a lot of ways to shape the system going forward, and most of the inspirational work has come from yourself and some of the trusts who try and push the sector further. That has been where the change has come from. So yeah, there's a lot of this resonates highly. I guess my question then is, we've been working for, I think, this fourth year of the National CEO Survey, which I should plug is open now for any CEOs who are on this call. I'm hoping you have the chance to complete this as soon as possible. But one of the things that we're seeing is when we ask trust leaders about their priorities, we see finance challenges coming to the front, workload challenges, inspection worries and all that. So there's a lot of pressures on trust leaders right now. And if we think about the Maslow pyramid of trust leadership, where you have, we need to make sure we have people in the schools, we need to worry about attendance, many of the very real operational challenges, then your civic and system leadership angles, they feel like the top of the pyramid, which is once we've sorted out the day-to-day. So what's your vision of a trust leader? How does a trust leader find capacity to focus on the higher order questions? And is this the 20% of their job, or should this be the 80% of their job?
So I think I'm going to start by answering that, Ernest. Actually, I should say first that the National Schools Trust Survey that we do with you is just so important. It performs such an important role in the system to really highlight what is on the top of the mind of trust leaders. So thank you very much for that collaborative enterprise. It is really important to us. But coming back to your key question, I don't think we should see these things as separate. So civic and system leadership are rooted in the challenges of the day-to-day, because they are the things that are putting pressure on our children, or the way we respond to things that are putting pressure on our children. The civic and system leadership invites us to think about the way the system is or isn't working, and what kind of society we want to create. So in a word, why does this book focus less on operational elements? Because I want to bring us back to purpose. And for me, this starts with something I heard Steve Mumby, who most colleagues on the school will know is formerly Chief Exec of the National College for School Leadership. So he said in a speech he gave in 2017, he said the wrong question is, should my school become an academy? He said a much better question is, how can my school best collaborate with others in a strong and resilient structure to ensure that each child is a powerful learner, and that adults have the opportunity to learn and develop as teachers and leaders. Isn't that beautiful? So I've always thought there was something fundamentally important and powerful in these words. A group of schools working together in a school trust is so much more than simply the changing of the legal structure of a trust. And I think this does start with purpose. So I'm always a little bit cautious to claim that I speak or I write from moral purpose, because I think morality is a complex ethical and philosophical field. And I think there is much overclaiming of moral purpose to seek a high ground that I'm not attempting to seek. So I am saying simply that I think contemplating Steve Mumby's beautiful question connects us to our purpose. It connects us to our why. So, Ernest, I know that you're familiar with the fact that I often rely on poetry to communicate an idea, and I want to offer you this poem today by William Stafford. It's called "The Way It Is." So, there's a thread you follow, It goes among other things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. So let's not ever let go of the thread of purpose, the why that binds us together.
Thank you for that, Leora. As always, you managed to find words out there that relate to your thoughts so beautifully. So thank you for that. And I think this is we'll speak more about this thread of purpose when we deep dive into some of those elements. But one of the kind of my final question on this general bit is if I can quote from a book that I really rate very highly, which is yours, a quote of where you are requoting from another piece from Henry Mintzberg, where you say remaining in the stratosphere of the conceptual is not better than having one's feet planted in concrete. And I find that what you do exceptionally well in this piece is you have this stratosphere thinking of what is this, the bigger picture that we're striving for, and then I wouldn't say planted in concrete, but heavily grounded examples, real world examples from trusts throughout the country who achieve some of these things. And the examples you give on reading and RC work, they feel so very tangible. My question would be, a lot of the case studies are from the larger trusts, and trusts we all know. There's Ted Ragg, there's Dixon's, and there's others. What would a lot of the trusts in the country are small and perhaps lack the resource or capacity that some of those system leading trusts might have. How would a small trust read this piece, and where should they seek inspiration within the piece?
Thank you for asking that question, Ernest, because I think it's a really important question, and you're right that there is a perception that the capacity lies in the larger trusts to do some of this work, particularly the civic work and the system leadership work. I don't think that's true, and also I don't think all the case studies are from the large trusts. So we've got Reach Academy Feltham, it's a single school. The Frank Wise Special School is a single school, and moreover, a maintained school. And I just say I'm delighted to have Frank Wise Special School in CST membership. The co-head teachers there are just absolutely wonderful. And Simon Knight, who is one of the co-head teachers, is actually on our policy advisory group. So I have always wanted to create an inclusive environment at CST. So we've never stopped any type of school joining. Any school can join CST. We speak for the trust sector, but that doesn't mean that we close off membership to other types of schools. So that sort of sense of belonging that colleagues can have when they join CST feels really important to me. And Simon was actually at our Send and Inclusion conference a couple of weeks ago, and he was on stage talking about the work that his school does. And he said something that was so important to me. He said, I feel like I belong at CST. That is from the co-head teacher of the maintained school. And I thought, yes, that's the culture, that's the ethos that I want to create at CST. So let me come back to your point. Reach Academy Feltham, single school, Frank Wise Special School, single school, Mulberry Schools Trust, 8 schools, Danes Educational Trust, 12 schools. It is the quality of the work that I'm highlighting in the book, not the size of the trust. And I know that quality is really important to every single CST member, and there is brilliant work going on in so many of our trusts. I had to limit myself because I couldn't write at home, and also because the publishers, to whom I'm very grateful, wanted me to write a book that people could actually read in a few sittings rather than a great big academic tome. So I was limited in the number of case studies that I could write. But there's so much brilliant work going on in the trust sector. And that's why I'm also very proud that, along with other organizations, we launched Inclusion in Practice as a way of collating evidence around brilliant SEND practice and brilliant inclusion practice to support the SEND reforms and the work of Tom Rees and his expert group on creating more inclusive schools. So quality, not size, matters.
Thank you. And you speak in the book about prioritizing, and we'll return a little bit to that. We'll return to that in the section where we talk about civic leadership. If anyone would like to come in on any additional questions that we haven't covered on the overall approach of the book, then please do feel free to write those into the chat, and I'll pick them up. But we will now move forward to talk about each of those three domains in a little bit more detail. We'll start with trust leadership, but we won't spend that much time there because that is the most aligned with what the trust leaders already have either read through the papers or have been implementing in their trust. And then we'll spend a bit more time on the civic leadership and system leadership elements. But yeah, please do feel free to come in with any questions you may have. So we're starting with trust leadership, and I think you're quite cautious in talking about trust leadership to not suggest that there is one way to run a trust or there is a recommended way to do a trust. You speak about the agency that trust leaders and in fact the schools within those trusts should hold. Do you feel we might be moving towards a more unified understanding of what works in the education sector, or do you feel this element of each trust having their own vision, their own set of values and approaches, is that the strength of the system?
So, will there ever be a unified understanding of what works? Yes and no. I think our diversity is our great strength, and I will do a huge amount to, protect that diversity. But there's a but there. We do need to better understand what practices work best for our children. So we need courage, and we need more research here. And I think that will, over time, result in greater alignment as we align ourselves around the evidence, as we must as professionals.
Thank you. And within finding that evidence, there's a question on experimenting, because you talk about the disruptive edge as the system gets more grounded and more stable. Experimenting and innovating is really difficult within the education sector. We work with children, they only have one shot at education. And so how do we find the time and capacity to innovate while ensuring that we steer the big ship of our schools forward?
So I should say that term disruptive edge comes from the brilliant writer and author Alex Hill in his book Centennials, where he explored the characteristics of organizations that had survived for over 100 years, hence the term centennials. And he says they've got some things in common. And one of the things they've got in common, which I absolutely loved, is what he calls stable core disruptive edge. So they build institutional strength and stability in order to survive. And that feels really important to me. So how in the trust sector do we build that organizational strength and stability? But alongside that, they maintain this disruptive edge. And I remember we asked Public First to do some work for us, for CST, testing how our members, but also policymakers, ministers, the wider system perceived us. And Public First came back and they said, you are part of the establishment now. CST is part of the establishment. You are a very authoritative organization in the system. You need to accept your role as authoritative. And there was a part of me that went, hooray, we've arrived. We are an authoritative organization. And then the more rebellious part of me that went, hang on a minute, I don't know that I want to be part of the establishment. What I was doing with CST was fundamentally disruptive, and I want to continue to be disruptive. And that is why the Alex Hill concept of stable core disruptive edge spoke so powerfully to me. And then in thinking about what I wanted CST to be, I thought, actually, that probably also describes the trust sector. The trust sector was born of innovation and disruption. Of course, we disrupted on the basis of poor outcomes for some of the most disadvantaged schools in the most disadvantaged communities. Of course, we want to keep that. Of course, we want to keep some of that innovation that we saw through the free school movement. Absolutely. But so the challenge here, which I think is a complex challenge, is how we build that core stability, that institutional strength, while maintaining that disruptive edge. And I have to say, the person that I've learned most from here is Luke Sparks, who's trust leader at Dixon's. So he has probably been the person who I've spoken to. I'm sure there are lots of others, but he's probably been the person I've spent more time with that has thought very deeply about this. And he reflected to me that there are potentially three, what he called bad options. So he was talking about this for Dixon's, by the way, not for anybody else. So you stay creative by staying small, but then you have less impact. So that's one option. The second option is you avoid the rules as you grow. And the impact of that is to suffer chaos as you become a larger organization. And the third is you use process as you grow to drive efficient execution of your current model, but you cripple creativity, flexibility, and the ability to thrive when things change. So those are options that I think Luke thought about and rejected. But he and his trust are experimenting with a fourth way. So an agile organizational culture that puts people at the center and which engages and empowers everyone in the organization so that everybody in the organization, it helps them to create value quickly, collaboratively, effectively. So he has done loads of thinking about what leadership in agile organizations looks like, and particularly how it serves people in the organization, empowering and developing them. So creating space for teams to discover new opportunities, respond to challenge, and to innovate. And I really love that thinking of the agile organization, and that's how you avoid the chaos, but you maintain the disruptive edge. So I don't know whether that speaks to other colleagues in this book club, but that felt powerful to me.
That's brilliant. And I wonder, when we think about innovating and experimenting, we can obviously learn from understanding our needs and working towards them, but there's a lot we can do by learning from others like Luke and many other trusts who've tried different things. You've collated some of the work in this book. You share very concrete examples. There's also the wider school improvement case studies that you and Steve are doing together with Impact Ed and collating various success stories from trusts. Edurio, we've also been attempting to collate case studies where we've interviewed the trusts that have the highest scores across topics like pupil happiness or balanced workload. So there are increasing amount of case studies on concrete elements which we can learn from. How does a trust find what works for them within the increasing evidence load? Because I think it was Dylan Williams who said everything works somewhere, nothing works everywhere. I might be misattributing the quote, but there's a lot of conditions that are relevant to within the trust to find out what works for them.
So I think this is a question that's larger than the book, much larger than the book, actually. And I don't think that the book really seeks to answer that question. I think some of the answer to the question lies in the work that Steve Rollis is leading on school improvement and on the school improvement inquiry. So as colleagues on the call may know, Steve spent 2 years chairing an inquiry into trust-led improvement, trust-led school improvement, which is how you do improvement at scale across a group of schools. The reason this work has been so important is the school improvement and effectiveness research treats always treats the unit of the school as the thing, as the entity. And it will always be the case that if we're responsible for school improvement, which we are in the trust sector, it's part of our core purpose, that we have to improve one school at a time, because schools are contextually different. So that is always the case. That vertical improvement that we do school by school will always be important. But I think there's an unleveraged part of school improvement, which in the conceptual model that Steve developed, we called horizontal improvement. And that is how you do improvement at scale across a group of schools. And that feels to me a really important space for the trust sector to properly understand and to begin to codify. And a large part of that actually is in the space of professional development. And for me, the only sustainable way of improving a school, any school, is to improve the quality of teaching in that school. And the way you improve the quality of teaching is through evidence-informed professional development. And if you're an organization that's working at scale, you can create that horizontal improvement structure. And that is just so powerful. So I don't know whether that fully answers your question, Ernest, but that's my best attempt.
Thank you. And I actually want to a little bit deeper in this, where you talk about evidence-based professional development and also innovation projects and finding that disruptive edge. All of that is something that is done by the staff, by the teachers, TAs, support staff in the schools. However, we also know that workload is such a major challenge across the sector. So how do we focus on professional development and those elements? Do we risk adding too much on their plates for them to cope with?
So that is a really profoundly important question, and is one that we must always have in our minds, Ernest. But I'm going to be a bit challenging and say I don't think it's the right question. The right question, I think, is how do we make our schools brilliant places to work? This gets us not into a binary dead end of workload versus professional development. What it does, I think, is it focuses our minds on school leadership, culture, and climate. It asks us to be more deliberate about making our schools really great places to work. And fortunately, we have the evidence for this from the Education Endowment Foundation's Rapid Evidence Review. So what EEF said, what they found in terms of their evidence review, is there are 3 interrelated leadership approaches and associated practices, which they highlight as contributing massively to staff retention. And it's not rocket science. So these are the 3: prioritizing professional development, building relational trust, and improving working conditions. Now, importantly, they say these are interrelated. So it's not one versus the other. You don't improve working conditions at the expense of professional development. These 3 things need to be prioritized together. We must do all 3, and we must not see one at the cost or the cause of another. And while we're on this, I'll just say one thing about improving working conditions. So you will note that that is not phrased as workload. Workload is a part of the way that we think about improving workload conditions for our staff, our teachers and our support staff and our leaders. But it's not the only thing. And so if we shift our mindset to thinking about what are the total of working conditions in this organization, and is this adding up to making a school and my trust be a brilliant place to work?
Yeah, thank you. And that actually resonates really well. When we interviewed the schools that had the best results in balanced workload, one of the things that consistently we saw was that these are from leaders who set an element of high expectations. They said, this is not going to be an easy role. We're trying to deliver for our children, and that's a within the current times, that's a really challenging thing to endeavor to do. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. But let's move forward, and let's talk about the element of civic leadership. And in a sense, I was wondering through reading that you talk about the loss of faith in public organizations, and that's something that trust leaders on this call will see and note, where there's I've heard the trust leaders say to me that they feel like they're a complaints processing unit now, and that there is this societal pressure on families and people in general, and that is finding its way through increasing friction between the trust and the community. How much can trusts put a dent in this? Is this not an issue too big for the sector?
So the first thing I would say is that this concept of loss of faith in public institutions, we are seeing across Western democracies. It's not just a thing that's happening in the English landscape or even the English schooling landscape. It is actually true for Western democracies, and there's data that supports that. So we lead in the context in which we lead. We might wish to live in a different society, but we don't. We live in a society in which there is a loss of public trust and confidence. And it is affecting our schools. It may not be, I'm hoping it's not actually expressed as a loss of trust and confidence in a school, but it is affecting our schools. It's affecting our schools through falling attendance, through parental complaints, through some of the behaviors that we're seeing, which frankly we wouldn't have seen pre-pandemic. So there's a thing for us to respond to. So we could moan about it. And we could say it's all the fault of society, and it's, we need government to do something about it. Or we could think deeply about what our role as leaders, particularly as civic leaders, is in this context, and how do we quite deliberately rebuild public trust and confidence. And that starts really with relationships with our parent body and our wider community. So this is the subject of our CEO Leadership Summit on the 7th and 8th of July. And I think the solution is by working much more deliberately with people and communities. So Hilary Cottam, whose work I absolutely love, she's not an educator. She works more in an analysis of the welfare state. She talks about essentially needing to see a shift from transactional ways of engagement to relational ways of engagement. In other words, we need to remake relationships. And there are some trusts doing brilliant work in remaking relationships. That earlier in the conversation, you mentioned Ted Ragg, and Moira Marder is doing some absolutely fabulous work on remaking relationships. So Reach Foundation is perhaps leading the way with their Cradle to Career model. There is some emerging evidence for how we do this, how we create this shift from transactional forms of engagement to relational forms of engagement.
And within this role, and I'm again going to refer to the book where you've adapted the 4 tests from the Civic University Commission on how trusts might want to approach this. And the first one is the public test, where you ask, do people talk about our schools with pride and awareness? Do children and parents feel a strong connection to our schools? And do we know their needs and challenges? And when I read through that public test, I noted that you say the schools, not the trust. And many trusts, trusts approach this in a different way. So there are trusts where they communicate through the trust brand, and then there are those who are very much in the background where the families won't know what the trust is. What's your vision on the role of the trust and the visibility of the trust within the sector?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the reason I don't like the term MAT and we talk about school trusts is parents send their child to a school. I don't know a parent who sends their child to a trust. They send their child to a school. So if we are in the business of remaking relationships, it has to be done at this very local level. The other thing is that this is particularly true for primary. Most parents will know the head teacher because the head teacher is a visible leader in the community. So the trust needs to mobilize through its schools. But it is also the case that these schools, this group of schools, are in a trust. So I think we need to remake relationships at all levels. So one of the things I hear quite a lot from colleagues who do loads of work with parents is that parents are confused and muddled about, for example, a trust complaints system. They understand a school complaint system, and they mostly understand that if they're not satisfied with the school complaint system, they can go to a local authority. So that process is understood. When the school is in a trust, they're more confused by that. So, what's the escalation rate? I'm not sure we're brilliant at this. Some trusts are, but I don't think we're uniformly brilliant at communicating this to parents. So, is there, um, you know, a published process of escalation? Is there a named person? Who can a parent who feels frustrated or feels they haven't got the right outcome? Who can they ring? Who can they talk to? This is how we remake relationships. And at the trust, that's not the only thing we do at the trust level, of course, but it's just an example of the way I think we remake relationships at all levels of the organization, but starting with the school, because parents send their child to a school.
Thank you. And if we talk about leadership with civic leadership, it is fundamentally embedded within external relationships, so engaging with other organizations, may those be NHS trusts or local authorities or charities or other organizations. With trust leaders, there will be a group who you'll see in many events who travel around, who speak on behalf of the trust publicly, vocally, who are quite happy to do that. And there will be trust leaders who are far more comfortable focusing within the trust. So is your take that everybody should look outwards and do more outwards, or is it fine to have a mix of leadership styles and approaches here?
So I think it depends on leadership is always contextual. It depends on where the schools in your group are. If you, for example, if you come into a trust as a new CEO and the schools are a bit vulnerable, they're not doing as well as they can. Our core purpose is to advance education for public benefit. There might be a period of time where you just need to focus on those schools, securing a really good understanding of what improvement is needed in those schools. So you might be more inward looking at that moment. I do think it's important to understand that leadership is contextual. And I also think that leadership is by definition outward facing. So I'm also very influenced by the work of Professor Jeff Mulgan, who's at UCL. He identifies that many new institutions have proved short-lived, and he kind of analyzes why. And he offers a view that perhaps too many have been set up to give the appearance of action rather than being based on sufficiently serious thought. And perhaps in too many cases, the design focuses solely on authority, on finance, on organograms, rather than issues of culture, intelligence, or relationships. And in analysing public institutions that have survived, so Melgon's a bit like Alex Hill on this, he offers a view that some of the institutions that have survived longest combine a strong moral ethos and a sense of mission, outward-facing mission, along with competence and excellence. And I think this is really the point. It's about balancing these things. And I believe the point about longevity is particularly important. So education policy, as we know, is typically fiercely contested. We're seeing that quite a bit at the moment. And timelines, as we're also seeing a bit at the moment, are often foreshortened to a political cycle. So in other words, a term of parliament. And we live in a democracy, and it's really important that we engage with parliamentarians and with policy. So education policy, like health policy, actually is inextricably linked to the government of the day, perhaps if only because of public funding. But I think we need to think, as leaders, we need to think in terms that are longer than the short-termism of political cycles, because I think this is how we build public institutions. So in a word, I think leadership by definition is outward facing.
And does that extend in a truly civic organization? Would you expect non-leaders or those in not on the very top of the leadership to engage beyond their organization as well. So I'm thinking about subject teams or careers focused, etc. Yeah, this outwards facing, is this the domain of trust leadership, or does that live beyond the various levels?
So I think I think yes. It's in different ways. We need to liberate our people to be outward focused. We cannot be isolationist. Um, if I come back to Professor Mulgan, he talks about sparring and ecosystems. So institutions sit within a landscape or in an ecosystem. Teams sit within an ecosystem of cooperation, of competition, of challenge. And no team and no institution is an island. So the work of design has to consider the wider context. Now, whether that's the wider context of the organization within which those teams are located, that too is outward facing from your department, outward facing from your school. I think these are some of the things that that help us to avoid complacency and stagnation. But I think at different levels of the organization, outward facing can mean different things.
Thank you. And my final question in this section is, when we talk about civic leadership, you talk a lot about place-based approaches where you work within your local community. And we also know that many trusts have a very diverse set of schools, even if they're geographically co-located. They're based on the kind of the very local elements. They might have different needs, or a primary will have a different needs to secondary or special school. What is the role of, I guess, more nationally driven initiatives that are focused more on the properties or characteristics of the school as opposed to the local environment itself?
Yeah, so on this one, I want to start by saying something that I say often in public speaking. The trust must anchor its school in its communities. That, without a doubt, the trust should anchor those schools even more deeply in their communities. It mustn't rip the school out of its community. That would be a terrible thing to do. So that notion of community anchoring feels really important, and I think as part of one of the core domains of the trust's work is to do that. But we also operate in a professional domain, and some constructs like professional development, teacher efficacy, assessment, for example, are pervasive. So I would say this is a both and, not an either or.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's jump towards system leadership. So this notion of acting on the system rather than just within the system. A lot of the system is architected by policymakers, by regulators. They set the inspection framework. They create a new bill which influences how we operate as a sector. For the trust leaders on this call and beyond, how much should they engage with policy matters, as they, much bigger than one big trust? Would you feel that the right way is to work through representative organizations like the CSD or ASCL or others, or do you think every trust should also be an advocate for policy changes?
So I think there are multiple ways to engage with policy, and I think representative organizations are one way, and they are an important way. But leaders are also public intellectuals with their own thoughts and beliefs. And I think public debate is really important when it's done respectfully. I think it enriches us. So William Blake is one of my all-time favorite poets, and of course he's also a visual artist. And he has this line, which I love, which is, "Without contraries is no progression." In other words, we can't progress if in the absence of contrary or public debate. We need that public debate to enrich us and to get to the best policy solutions. So, of course, I am the CEO of CST. I will say that I think please do, to work through us in terms of policy solutions. But I also think as public intellectuals, you need to engage in different mechanisms, different forms of debate if we are to enrich the debate.
Thank you. And I think actually that is particularly strong with a lot of the regional networks that you talk about. There's the Education Exchange, but there's others like Schools Northeast and others where they collectively talk about regional needs, and that influences the policy within that space. And then a question about the system. So acting on the system, a lot of that happens through the shape of the trust sector changing. So in particular, we're seeing a lot of consolidation. We've seen a lot of consolidation over the last few years where the number of schools within trusts has grown without the number of trusts growing as much. And now the current government has been agnostic on the trusts as the anchors of the system. However, the sector has responded with consolidating more than ever. And my question there is, it feels that a lot of the consolidation right now is financially driven, so driven by those very real operational challenges that trusts are facing. You talk about working together for values, for culture, to enact your vision. Is there a risk within this current wave of consolidation that we are bringing together folks with different values? And how do we make sure that we design a system that we want for our children as we keep consolidating and going through this phase?
So you're right to cite the data. The number of academy schools has increased over time, and is now more than half the schools in England, and that's important. The number of trusts has actually declined over time. So you are right to say that we are seeing consolidation in the data. On the point of this being financially driven, I would say that that financial sustainability is a really important consideration for a trust board when it's considering its future. So is educational sustainability. And I would actually put educational sustainability above financial sustainability. They're often related, by the way, but educational sustainability comes first. How can we sustain the highest quality education for the children and young people in the schools we run? That's the question the trust boards must answer. Context matters hugely here. So a smaller trust based in an inner London borough, which is geographically quite tight, where the schools are very proximate, is probably more sustainable than the same set of schools in a much more geographically dispersed area. So context does matter when trust boards think about this. I think we're starting to do this really well in the sector, actually. I feel very proud of some of the recent announcements. So, for example, last week we had EBOR and Nexus announce that they're consulting on becoming a single organisation. Now, although that announcement is new, those two CEOs, Gail and Warren, have been working together for a long time. And I know that they've tested values alignment and cultural alignment across their organizations, across their schools. So there's lots of work that has to be done to make sure that consolidation is truly effective and truly is going to improve the quality of provision for all the children and young people in the group. It can be done. I think we know how to do it. I think we've got some really good blueprints for it. And as I say, I feel really proud that we are seeing CEOs, people at the top of the organization, chairs of trust boards, putting aside self-interest and saying, we think educationally, financially, philosophically, culturally, we think consolidation is the best path here.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we have a few minutes left, so we'll move to concluding thoughts. We've covered the trust leadership, civic leadership, system leadership, and by the way, I should say thanks to everybody who's contributed through the chat with your perspectives. what what is your vision for the direction of the trust sector? So you work a lot representing the needs of the trust and working towards uh, uh, towards helping the dialogue between the sector and the policymakers. Uh, if we think about the system leadership angle, what would be your system leadership priorities for the next 5 years?
So I'm going to say three very quickly. First of all, that together we build strong trusts, and CSD's done loads of work on this. Secondly, that the system we build together is built on collaboration and a shared evidence informed by a shared conception of quality. And thirdly, that we aim to become the best system at getting better.
Fantastic. The best system at getting better. Um, so for the trust leaders here on this call, they're from many different roles, different trusts. Where should they start? Some will have read the book, some will have not. But yeah, what should somebody on the call do next to consider at becoming a better at these new domains of educational leadership?
Uh, so I think this is very context dependent. The first and foremost responsibility of any trust is to advance education for public benefit. So a place to start, I'm not going to make the book a place to start. I'm going to say a place to start is to be clear in answer to these three questions. What do you believe in? What do you stand for? What do you promise?
Thank you, Leora. Well, you're far too humble to make the book as a place to start, but I'm not. So I will definitely say if you haven't yet read the book or purchase them for your colleagues, that's a wonderful place to start and explore this deeper. We've been very, very fortunate to spend an hour with Leora. You spend so much time representing the needs of the sector, and it's very refreshing to be able to just learn from your vast experience from what you've seen with the sector by working with it day to day. So thank you for your continued leadership. Really, really grateful for the session and look forward to the many conversations that'll stem from this.
Thank you, Ernest. It's been a delight.